Okay, well, hello everyone. My name's Clay Wirestone. I'm the Communications Director at Kansas Action for Children, and please accept our apologies for some technical issues. The fabled technical issues did not get us last week. They got us this week, and who knows, they might get us in the future too. But for now, we're up and we're going. I hope that everyone has had a good week, that everyone has been safe and cozy and comfortable in their homes. I think most of us have, although 3 weeks of social distancing, the time is beginning to mount a little bit. But for those of us who are, but for those of you who might be interested in what Kansas Action for Children is doing, what we're talking about these days, I would definitely to follow all of our social media channels. If you're on Facebook now at facebook.com/KSAction, yeah, you're already watching this, but you can also follow us on Twitter at Kansas Action. So that would be twitter.com/Kansas Action. So today, our conversation is going to be about that most exciting of all topics, the state budget. That's a little bit of a sarcastic comment. Back when I was in the newspaper business, we would sometimes joke about the effect that putting a word like budget in a headline would have on some people. But the fact is, when it comes to programs that help Kansas kids and families, the annual state budget is hugely important. It's a critical document that doesn't just affect what goes on in Topeka, but really goes down to cities and towns across the state. And so to help us go through this year's budget and to help us figure out what some of it means, we're excited to have Kansas Action for Children's Vice President Adrienne Olenick joining the video cast today. So hello, Adrienne.
Hey, Clay.
How are you doing?
I'm excited about the budget.
Well, good. We should also note, though, that you also do volunteer tax preparation work as well. So it's true.
I like my numbers.
That's right. So Adrienne, let's just talk about the basic big numbers here. What is this year's state budget looking like?
Well, as you can imagine this year, with all of the complications that we're all seeing from the coronavirus, it did have an impact on this year's budget. I think some of that will still yet be seen in the coming months as this develops, but the good news is that the legislature was able to pass a budget before they left Topeka in mid-March. So we are in a pretty good spot as far as having the majority of our required work done for the year in Kansas as compared to some other states. So the legislature adjourned on March 19th. Currently, they're planning on coming back April 27th, but we're not sure that that will actually happen. So technically, they would need to still come back to really kind of close out the session, but they have done the required piece, which is passing the budget, which is what I want to talk to you about. So the budget passed the Senate, 28 members voted for it, 10 against, and the House, 99 members voted for it and 16 against the budget. And for those of you who follow bill numbers and such, if you want to find more information, the budget is under Senate Bill 66. That is what passed. And what happened is what they do for the budget is that they consider the current year that we're in, which is called fiscal year 2020. So they consider, do they need to add a little bit more for the rest of this year? So they addressed any additions or changes to this year's budget. And then they passed a budget that would start July 1st for fiscal year 2021. So for fiscal year 2021, the total budget is a $19.9 billion budget, and then that's from all funds. A lot of times when we talk about the budget, we're just talking about what is the state general fund, which is $8 billion of that nearly $20 billion. So that gives you an idea of how much money the legislature is really talking about when they pass a budget. And as you can see, it's significant. So a couple of key things that I want to talk about before we go into some of the specific areas that KAC watches in the budget every year are some of the big ticket items. The legislature passed a new transportation plan for the coming decade, and they called it the Eisenhower Legacy Transportation Plan. So that is an amount of money that they're going to spend over the next 10 years. What I found was interesting when I was looking at the details is there is a section in the plan that's called the $8 million promise. And so in the next 10 years, by 2030, part of this plan is a commitment to spend at least $8 million in every Kansas county. So I thought that was interesting that they were recognizing that there are projects and plans and enhancements that need to happen no matter where you're at in Kansas. As you know, over the budget trickiness we've had over the past decade, sometimes that money in the transportation fund is sometimes used to come back over to the state general fund to shore up parts and pieces that we just didn't have enough money for. So while there is still a transfer from the transportation dollars to come to our general fund, they are trying to reduce and limit that. So they still made that effort to try to keep those transportation dollars in the transportation fund.
And that's what the legislators sometimes have called the Bank of KDOT, right?
Yeah, thanks, Clay.
Yeah.
That is the colloquial term there. Also, as I am broadcasting from rural Kansas, I would like to also note that sometimes internet is tricky here a little bit. And even living in Shawnee County, that can be a challenge. So within this transportation plan also is a commitment, which many people are talking about, for rural broadband infrastructure. So I won't get into all the specifics, but know that transportation sometimes looks a little different. It's not always just your roads and bridges and highway projects. So they're really thinking about what does that infrastructure look like.
Well, I'll also mention, Adrienne, I'm just saying you're coming across great right now. So
no one else is streaming or shouldn't be here at the house right now, even to watch me. So So another part that we talk about often in the state budget, another fund that has really not been in existence for some time, is I'm going to get a little wonky here, but it's the local ad valorem tax reduction fund. And this is fancy kind of terminology for giving money back to locals so that they can reduce the property tax burden for residents in their cities and their counties. For a long time, that money has not been given to the counties and the cities to reduce property taxes. And for the first time, for a long time, this has been coming back up in conversations. And there was some indication that maybe that would come back to be, given back out. But alas, with all of the complications here at the end and the recognition that we might be in a different budget situation due to the coronavirus, that money did not go forward. So it was taken out of the budget. So I thought I would just also share that the budget situation, it takes a lot of work for the legislature to do this, but I'm looking at hours and hours of the Senate floor debate and some of the House floor debate. It's clear that legislators had been working on the budget as normal through January, February, and March, and really were in the position to vet the budget that they passed and have good discussion about it. And while it's a little bit more basic or simplified, I know as advocates, a lot of us were working on particular pieces. I'll mention a few of those later that didn't make it into the budget. They did pass a budget that is adequate and will meet our needs for fiscal year 2021, considering the amount of time that they had to pass the budget.
Well, and the context with this, right, is that there was the expectation that they would at least be in Topeka for another couple of weeks before they began their April break. And those couple of weeks did not happen. They were rightly concerned about, having large gatherings together in this time of coronavirus and concerns about the spread. So the House passed the bill extremely quickly, and then the Senate came back after the weekend, I believe, and hustled it through as well. So, it led to, as we will see, some perhaps not great things, but also some other things that maybe were okay. So, one of the things that definitely wasn't okay, though, and this is my awkward segue, is that we did not see, at least at this point, Medicaid expansion pass. So, Adrienne, if we could talk a little bit about kind of the health components of the budget and what's in there.
Yeah. So as Clay said, Medicaid expansion is still one of those items where if they come back for further days of session sometime this year. Advocates, we are still hoping that there is a window of opportunity, especially given that folks need healthcare more than ever during these times. To give you a little bit of a sense for what the budget looks like for Medicaid expansion, there's $17.5 million for Kansas's portion in the budget to expand Medicaid. And when you really start to look at other components in the budget, that is a very small amount of money that would go to help a ton of people given the federal match of 90 to 10 on Medicaid expansion. So what was interesting in the final budget discussions, especially on the Senate side, were the multiple amendments that were offered up to take that $17.5 million and spend it elsewhere in the budget. I won't tell you all of those different amendments and details, but what ultimately passed was that $17.5 million is still there in the budget, with also language prohibiting Medicaid expansion outside of the legislative process. But if for some reason Medicaid expansion does not pass this session, that $17.5 million can be used for coronavirus funding and has been given the authority of the State Finance Council. Also, within the health part of the budget, two other key items I wanted to note was something that advocates have been working on for several years as it relates to food assistance, or the SNAP program. In past legislation, there was the restriction for the Secretary of the Department for Children and Families to request what's called a waiver from the federal government. In times of a recession, we would have had the opportunity to get some extra help for a certain demographic of folks known as ABODs, or able-bodied adults without dependents, who often have children, they just maybe don't live with them full time. So many advocates have been working this year on Senate Bill 484, which would have given the secretary that ability to request the waiver. And so good news is that right before they left, they included the language of this bill into the budget. And while it's not a permanent fix, it does set Kansas up to be in a better position to respond to a potential or looming recession in the coming year. It's not instantaneous that we can request that waiver. There are lots of technicalities around that, but know that that was a great win for the state of Kansas and being able to help provide food assistance for Kansans in the coming years. And it's something that we should look to make a more permanent ability for our state to do. And then the last item in the health section, while there was a ton of other things, I'm just going to highlight a few things. I wanted to note that there was one positive change on Medicaid that I wanted to highlight, was that they increased dental reimbursement rates in Medicaid, which was much needed, and it was several $1 million. So that was another positive improvement that was made.
Okay, and I mean, it really, I mean, it can't be underscored enough how important it is to have that provision for the ABOD waiver. I mean, essentially that is a policy change that will allow, you know, thousands of Kansans to receive food assistance who might not otherwise be able to receive it. And this was why it was something that policy advocates across the spectrum, I know our friends at Kansas Appleseed spoke about it, you know, we spoke about it. It was something that the Department of Children and Families, I believe, wanted to do as well. So it was quick and a little surprising actually to see it happen as quickly as it did, but we're certainly glad to see that included. So then kind of moving on, there's also, you know, there are also some components in the budget related to early learning, which is another one of our key issue areas here at KAC. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, one of the key parts of the state's large overall budget is what we call or not we as Kansas, but what was established as the Children's Initiatives Fund. And that actually is money that is put into the CIF, as I'll call it, from the KEY Fund, which is the Kansas Endowment for Youth Fund. So what happens, for decades now, Kansas has received an annual stream of funding from the Master Tobacco Settlement dollars that many states are currently getting. And Kansas decided to put that money towards early learning and programs that help kids. So we have been, you know, monitoring the CIF ever since its inception here at Kansas Action for Children. And we always look to see kind of how those monies are being spent and making sure that the legislature keeps their promise to kids by keeping those dollars in the CIF. And the good news is that, you know, nothing really changed from the CIF from this last year to the next year. Its total allocation will be about $52 million. And when you look at the details of where all that money goes, it's a variety of places. So I won't share all of those, but we're happy to provide that information if you want that. The Children's Cabinet is the agency that monitors and helps keep track of those dollars. And a big part of the $52 million, 18 million of it is what the Children's Cabinet allocates to early childhood block grants, where many programs across the state receive direct funding for their early childhood programs. So we were happy to see that, that funding is still secure and in there for the kids of Kansas. And we hope that, in the coming years, we can allocate even more dollars, that help kids in those programs. One thing we were working on is an example of something that as advocates, we were pushing for things in the budget or other bills, and with, the legislature having to stop early and the uncertainty of whether they'll come back, we're not sure what will happen with these dollars. But one of the federal programs where Kansas receives quite a bit of funding is the Child Care Development Block Grant. Those federal dollars come down to the state, and the state has to match some of those dollars and also have a maintenance of effort to receive full federal funding for the Child Care and Development Block Grant. Unfortunately, Kansas is one of very few states that hasn't been drawing down all of their federal dollars for this fund. And so KAC was working to make sure that we had full state matching dollars to draw down all of the federal funds. We know that, as we're seeing right now in this pandemic, that childcare, whether their facilities are open and helping, meet the needs of emergency workers or essential staff, or whether childcare home-based or centers have had to close due to health and safety reasons. We know how important childcare is to the infrastructure of our state and our nation. So we, if it doesn't happen this year, we certainly will be sharing more as the, next session arrives about how important it is that we draw down all of our federal dollars for childcare. And what that looks like is part of that funding is direct payments to eligible families to help pay for their childcare. So it is really an important program, and I encourage you to let more people know about that there is this program, Child Care Assistance, or the Child Care Subsidy, that helps, directly pay for your child care if you're eligible for that. So it's a great program that not enough people know about.
Well, and I think that's something that a lot of folks are seeing now. It's something that we're certainly seeing at Kansas Action for Children, is that so many of these programs that we advocate for and that we talk about, they really touch on needs that people are experiencing, right now in times of crisis. With childcare being one, with healthcare being one, it just goes on down the line. There was also a bit of a change made to the TANF program, or the Temporary Aid for Needy Families program. So what happened there?
Yeah, so that, similar to the last minute inclusion of language for the ABOD waiver, we had another great addition with language from SB 485. And what this allows, when a new parent is receiving TANF cash assistance, they are subject to having to go back to work pretty quickly after giving birth. And so what this bill and the language that was added to the budget allows a new parent to stay home longer and still receive their cash assistance if they're enrolled in a qualified home visiting or parenting skills class. So we know how important home visiting is for new parents to just understand, how to handle this new, wonderful life that you have in your household. And sometimes that is really difficult for families to find work so quickly when they have a brand new newborn. And we were really excited to see that this change was put into the budget to allow parents to stay home a little bit longer while still receiving the vital income support at that time in their lives. So I might also mention, because I've had some questions about the impacts of the executive reorganization order for DCF and how that affects the budget. So since we're talking about a lot of the Department for Children and Families programs, the legislature did reject the request to combine and merge some different parts of of state agencies into one Department for Human Services agency. So what the impact of that on the budget is really, there really isn't an impact. There weren't additional money set aside for that reorganization. What it just looks like is that now, an amount that was listed for this department is, it's a negative positive, and it's a net amount. So just know that that didn't actually have a budget impact. When you're looking through documents, it might just look a little odd if you see money disappear from one line to be added into another, because it was in the governor's budget within that kind of frame that it would pass.
Absolutely. And then I'm just going to seize the wheel of the bus here just for a moment, just because the next thing to talk about is budget and tax policy, a subject near and dear to my heart, as well as our director of policy and research, Emily Fetch, who is our shadow on this call, in case Adrienne drops out for technical reasons. But one of the things we were concerned about this session was the possibility of some dramatic tax provisions passing, possibly something that would really notably reduce revenue. And one of the upshots of this hurried kind of budget process, or this, let's just say, expeditious budget process, was that none of the tax proposals that we were concerned about ultimately passed both houses. So, attempts to change, kind of corporate taxes, the individual tax rate. There were a lot of attempts to look at property taxes. Basically, none of those became law. It looked as though several were teed up for some sort of action, but they pretty much all are still sitting there. If there's anything else, Adrienne, you could add there.
No, you're right. I mean, we really didn't see any significant tax legislation pass, especially none that KAC was closely monitoring. Some got close, and some are what we call below the line, where they're just sitting there, waiting for a chamber's votes on them. But we'll just have to see if they come back, and if there will be the ability to even, talk about those items. There will be a lot of important things if they do come back.
Yeah, I mean, so just to detour again just a bit, the forecasts right now for the coronavirus cases in Kansas call for the peak. At one point they were saying the peak was going to be April 26th. I believe it has now been changed to say that the peak is April 28th. The date that the legislature was supposed to come back into session was April 27th, which just suggests that legislators will probably not be returning when they had expected to. So that puts the rest of the session in. There's just a big question mark. We don't really know.
Yeah.
But with that being said, and talking about coronavirus, definitely there were definitely some items put in the budget that were meant to kind of help the response to this. So, Adrienne, what's up with those?
Yeah, so like I said, I mean, they were talking about passing this budget and getting out of, the state capitol building, so that they could all be at home and be safe as well. But the good news is that they knew somewhat, the beginnings of what was happening. So they did allocate some monies directly in the budget for the coronavirus response. So one I already mentioned was the Medicaid expansion dollars. Should Medicaid expansion not go through, those dollars could be used in response. Also, $15 million was approved for the Adjutant General in Kansas for response efforts, and another $50 million for coronavirus response was approved under the purview of the Legislative Coordinating Council, which is the group of legislative leadership from both chambers and both parties. The legislature also did change some requirements around unemployment insurance benefits. I'm sure a lot of you have seen that in the news. I won't go into a ton of detail, but basically they extended the length of time that someone could be on unemployment in Kansas. So they did that before they left as well. And so just to kind of, wrap up with the key items is that they did pass the budget. What happens next is the governor has to, sign or approve the budget, which she did on March 25th. So just, a handful of days after the legislature passed the budget. And often the governor, can do what's called a line item veto, where she goes through and changes some things or says no or yes to various parts, but she made no changes. So the budget, as we analyzed and looked at it and what came through and what was the conference committee reports, the kind of agreements that the House and Senate made when they negotiated the final budget, all stood through the governor's approval. One other thing to note about what's coming up, April 20th, as far as we know, is still going to go forward for the consensus revenue estimates. That body meets twice a year in April and November. So I do want to be clear that this budget, as was noted on the Senate floor, this budget is based on the amount of revenues that we expected outside of this pandemic. So they're based more on the November estimates than, so they're coming up in April and will be revising estimates. They sure do have a job ahead of them. I'm not quite sure how all of this pandemic will affect their process and what that will look like, but know that we at KAC are going to be monitoring revenue estimates, and all of the impacts of this on state revenues. So, this budget has a pretty strong ending balance right now, and we're just unsure of what, the revenue impact is going to be from the pandemic. If you look at March revenue estimates, they were pretty close to what we expected, which is just clear that it really hasn't had an impact quite yet. April is typically one of the months where we see a lot of increased revenue because typically tax day is April 15th, where a lot of people have to get in the amount of money they owe to the state by that time. But to help taxpayers during this time, the federal government and the state of Kansas has extended the time to file and pay your taxes to July 15th. So we know automatically that that is going to have an impact on the amount of revenue and the time frame for when Kansas will start to receive all of that revenue that they typically would have received in April or by April 15th. So it's going to be a little, from my opinion, which I'm not the best expert sometimes on, all these tricky things, but what does that look like, when we look at April revenue numbers? Will it just be delayed? Will that money be coming in later? Or, it's going to be hard to kind of understand like exactly what is going on with some of those numbers. So I'm sure the consensus revenue estimating group, which is full of a lot of really smart tax people, will start to kind of sift through some of those impacts and also have some revenue estimates. But I suspect that they will also have a lot of uncertainty as well that they'll be dealing with.
Well, I think if there's anything that everyone is certain on right now, it is how much uncertainty we are all going through. These are uncharted waters in a lot of ways, just in terms of the scope of what's happening to our economy right now, and for many folks and families who are at home and possibly navigating some of these systems, like the unemployment system, for the first time. But I think if there's any plus to the situation is that everyone is going through it together. Everyone is navigating these uncertain times, as everyone else is. So, Adrienne, any other thoughts? Any other ponderings as we finish up looking up at the budget?
Yeah, I did make two more quick notes for those of you who are wondering about school funding, and kind of what's just going on with schools. Just want to let you know that there weren't significant changes to school funding in this year's budget. In fact, school funding increased a little bit because what's called the base aid per pupil did increase this year. So schools will actually see a little bit of an increase as of, the way the budget is right now. And the legislature also passed a bill to allow schools to waive the required number of hours that students have to attend in the building, based on, their school district's ability to have that continuous learning plan. So if you have kids at home, you probably know what I'm talking about. There's a lot of good learning going on at home as best as school districts can manage. And then I know that my family enjoys being outside as much as possible and, going to the state lakes and other areas of the state that, we're so fortunate to have here in Kansas. So a lot of you will probably recall just the amount of rain and water that the state was dealing with around this time last year and into the summer. And so many of those areas were damaged across the state. And, I'm trying to get outside right now as much as possible to just, for my mental health and to enjoy this time of year. So one item in the budget that does talk about that is an extra $2 million that they allocated for state park flood repairs. So I'm hopeful that, that work can continue over this coming year to make sure that people are able to be outside when it's, socially distanced, safe, to just enjoy, some of the natural beauty that our state has. So that those facilities will be repaired.
And Adrienne, we had a couple of late breaking questions in the Facebook comments here. One of them from Modi, hi Modi, was asking if additional federal funds, which we talked about last week a little bit, if any of the additional federal funding would be included in the consensus revenue estimates. I mean, I wouldn't know that for sure, but I would assume yes. I don't know.
That's a good question. I probably need to follow up, and I guess Emily is technically on our call back here. If she knows that, she's welcome to chime in too. But I think we usually it has to do with just the state revenues, as I understand it. So I'm not sure if what they'll look at as far as federal funds coming in. But I'd be happy to look for that and also follow up with you on that. Because we do know Kansas will be getting, obviously some state relief dollars. And I suspect that, maybe more will be coming as they look at more relief packages that they haven't yet passed.
And there was also a question about any of the tobacco settlement remaining in Key. I mean, it's generally, that's just where all of the tobacco settlement money goes every year, right? And it's then sent into the Children's Initiative Fund. That's how I understand it. Adrienne is.
Yeah, so I haven't seen what our estimated payment is. I think we're probably getting around this time of year, and I may just not have seen that yet. So what I understand is that there was about an $8 million balance in the fund, and so they didn't have to use to make up that $52 million in the CIF this year. I believe they only transferred about 42 or $43 million from the Key Fund for the next fiscal year. So I'm not sure what the balance is in Key Fund right now, but I'd be happy to look that up and respond to someone.
Okay, fabulous. Oh, and there we go. Our board member, Nancy McCarthy Snyder, is also in the comments now, pointing out that apparently the federal funds are not included in the revenue estimates. It's only tax revenue.
And she would know. She is one of those experts I refer to.
Absolutely. I would also just point out as we are point out as we are wrapping up, prepositions are giving me some problems right there, that one of the resources that we've added to our website this week is at our KAC blog, and it is a list of tips and tricks to working from home. An experience that I'm sure a lot of you who are watching are experiencing possibly for the first time in a protracted way, as are many of us. But our Director of Organizational Effectiveness, Jamie Jones, pulled those together, and it's a really helpful look at various ways to organize yourself and your time. So with that, I would like to say thanks so much to Adrienne for being here. Thank you, Adrienne.
You're welcome. Thanks for encouraging me to do a Facebook Live event, Clay.
And thanks to all of you for watching. Have a fantastic day, and we will see you all soon.